This is the Texas Land Guys podcast, hosted by brothers Tim Dosch and Tom Dosch. With their partners David Marshall and Trip Rich, they have built DMRE, the leading land brokerage in Texas. With decades of experience brokering deals between landowners and real estate developers, they take you inside the deals that move the market.
All right, well, welcome to today's podcast. Excited to be here with Trey McGinn in our Dallas office. We have a kind of unique episode today. We're going to do something that is timely. A lot of you have been calling and talking to us about the new Texas Senate Bill 840 that was recently passed. And we see that having a huge impact up here in the Dallas market. And so if you're a new listener to the podcast, this is going to be a pretty specific topic that we're going to cover, and some of this may go a little bit over your head, but that's okay. This is, I think, something we're going to try to break down and explain the best we can, and we believe it's going to have a big impact here in DFW, and so we're going to get into that and explain what it is, and should be a good conversation today. So, Trey, thanks for joining me to do this.
Yeah, thanks for having me back. Excited to talk about Senate Bill 840. Really big change that's coming across that went through Texas House and Senate recently. That's going to have a very big impact if it goes into law, and very big impact relative to how we approach sites here in DFW and across Texas.
And so this is one Senate bill that was passed. There's actually others that were passed in this recent session that are going to have an impact on land across the state. Like I said, we're recording here from Dallas. It does impact the entire state, but the 20 or so cities that this bill impacts, because it's really cities in the state of Texas that have a population greater than 150,000 and are located in a county greater than 300,000. Most of those cities are actually here in our market in the DFW region. Right. So do you want to kind of maybe walk through, Trey, some of those cities and what they are?
Yeah, for sure. The biggest cities that are on the list, so Frisco, McKinney, Plano, Irving, Grand Prairie, Arlington, Garland, Denton, Dallas, and Fort Worth are all cities that qualify, which is really very interesting because in a certain aspect, when you read this bill and you read the implications of what it does relative to allowing commercially zoned sites, whether it's retail, office, warehouse, or just general commercial, these sites now have the opportunity to be developed as mixed use or multifamily in those municipalities. And when you think back on the list that we just went over, the first kind of handful of Frisco, McKinney, Plano, and Irving, those have been some of the toughest municipalities in DFW to get multifamily zoning in. So it's really an interesting change that we're talking about, and it feels very targeted in what we'll talk about today.
Yeah, and I think the kind of the why behind this bill is Texas is trying to address what many people believe is just an affordable housing crisis that we're experiencing in the state. There's a significant shortage of housing just for the population growth that we've had. And to your point, Trey, there's certain areas that have been very pro-development where you can get homes on the ground, you can get multifamily units built, but then there's other areas where you're fighting on the single-family side, you're fighting to get any kind of lot density, and on the multifamily side, you're really fighting to get any kind of multifamily, almost any kind of multifamily done, right, even if it's a really nice Class A dense product. So those first cities that you mentioned, I happen to live in Frisco, and that's a city that has historically been very difficult to get new multifamily approved. If it's more of an affordable multifamily, Frisco's been much more focused on type 1, very dense, oftentimes now more high-rise podium type development, which is very expensive. And so this bill was passed to try to get a lot of these cities to start working with developers to be able to deliver this affordable housing to the communities. And so we see this having a pretty big impact. Right. What was your first thought? I mean, I think we probably started really cluing into this just before it officially passed about a month ago.
Yep. I think my first thought when I heard about it is there's no way this is real.
Yeah.
It can't be true, right? It's really, in some facets, it's what we would dream of here in Dallas-Fort Worth when we're talking about, Frisco, for example, where we both live. We've had developers go in there as recent as 6 months ago with an incredible mixed-use plan on a 30-acre site that's going to have retail, commercial, townhomes, and multifamily. You would think this is a really good proposition for a site up in North Frisco, where there hasn't been quite all the growth catch up to it. And Frisco's response was, we're done with wrap product. And the developer was proposing, 4-story surface park. And now it sort of checks and balance everything we're talking about, in that the negotiation really shifts. With this going into law, now you can go do that by right without having to go in and negotiate through site plans. And ultimately, you get to build what the market dictates. And that is where the opportunity to create affordability in the marketplace comes from, just ease of getting everyone into more supply and more development without having these delays where cities are just taking, months and months and months to get back to you, even if it's a really good plan. We have other deals where it's an incredible project, and a lot of times it gets killed by the city just because of how long it takes to get a response and people move on. So there's a lot of things that this could provide, just a huge opportunity for the marketplace in how it progresses. I know that there's certain municipalities that were very, very caught off guard by this. And there's a lot of council members in different municipalities who are sort of shocked and saying, this is not good for our communities. This is not good for, whatever municipality it may be. And I think ultimately that's because, to a certain extent, they've been used to having the heavy hand in the negotiation and just being able to say no. And so my hope for this bill, honestly, there is the element of I can do this by right, but my hope is that it just brings everyone to the table to negotiate a little bit more fairly on what should really be a good project for a certain site.
Yeah, that's a good point. And I think, from talking to developers early on, and we're very early on, so
Right.
we've started to make offers now. We're starting to hear the buzz in the market. Landowners are talking about it now, but most developers, I think, are wanting to take the position that they want to work with cities versus go by the letter of the law and try to just slam projects in. They still want, to build successful projects. And so they want to keep a good relationship with the city. There's so many unknowns at this point around, like you said, the site planning process is defined and that appears to be resolved, but the permitting process and, ultimately getting your CO from the city, just a number of things to have to work through that are kind of an unknown at this point. So my initial reaction was that, to your point, this doesn't sound like this could be real. Yeah. And so I think we've had developers say the same thing, kind of say, a lot of developers have cited to us laws that have passed in California, Florida, other laws in Texas. Everyone seems to know of another, not direct comparison, but another example that's similar, and kind of try to cite that and say and see if cities didn't follow it. This one feels a little bit different. It's so sweeping, but at the same time, you mentioned it earlier, it's also very targeted because it doesn't really apply. There aren't really cities in the San Antonio, Austin market that it really applies to in a big way. And then Houston doesn't have zoning. And so, of the 20 or so cities that have a population large enough, it's really these DFW cities that I think people and developers have struggled the most to get developments done. And so the flip side is I know the cities themselves, the council members may not be happy. You and I have heard many stories from landowners that are stuck with properties that they can't sell because they've tried to sell them to different developers. They've been denied for industrial. They've been denied for multifamily. They've been denied for single family. It's almost like, there's no way to develop these properties. And so this won't solve that in some of the smaller cities like the South Lakes and the Grapevines and the Flower Mounds, but could have a really big impact in some of these other areas that we're talking about.
Yeah, that's right. And I think it certainly puts power back in the landowner's hand or the property owner if it's existing development. Ultimately, there's a lot of projects that we've worked on over the years where, it's a zoning case and the landowner has to stand up and say, you guys all want commercial on my site. I've owned it for 30 years. Why have I never gotten commercial offers close to what multifamily or townhome or other uses can pay? And so I think that's the benefit there. And it is really interesting when you think about, this bill was approved by the House and the Senate, both to such a majority that Governor Abbott didn't even have to sign it for it to go into law. It carried with enough majority that all the senators, were saying, hey, this is something that we really support and we need. And, affordability in housing is such a big topic right now. And so there's a lot of people on the more charity side, the more nonprofit side, looking for ways to help people get affordability in housing. And it's very easy to sit here and just think about it from a developer standpoint or from a city standpoint, but there are people who need this housing. And so that's really where and why it was created. And maybe that's a good place to jump in and just talk about, like, what is the bill from your standpoint and everything you've read? What does the bill actually, define, and what are the parameters that we're sort of operating within?
Well, and I'll start by saying we're learning every day,
right?
Because this is new, and we've been talking to, as many people as we can, developers. Tommy Mann at Winstead's been very helpful to us, helpful to several of our developers. He's written a great article, just summarizing the bill. But even with that, there's going to be a lot of nuances. There's still a lot of unknowns. But what we can talk about is at least some of the aspects of the bill that we've been discussing with clients. And as we're now making offers with clients, I would say kind of what our clients are having to say, okay, we may not know everything, but we're going to kind of proceed under these assumptions. And so the first thing, and you already said this, Trey, what's so significant about this bill is what it's trying to accomplish is taking either commercial zone properties, so think retail or office, or existing developments like office that's maybe defunct, it's got high vacancy, and there's a lot of that in certain markets in DFW, just older office buildings that have really struggled. But those cities have not wanted to grant rezones to other uses. I'm thinking about a property in Irving that we have been working on where we tried to rezone it for apartments and we tried to rezone it for industrial, and the city of Irving wanted it to stay office. And so this bill will directly apply to that. So a property that is zoned commercial or office, or is in a planned development that is commercial or office, you now by this new law that was passed can go and do multifamily on that property. And it's very valuable if you're able to take a property that has an existing development on it, because what they're really wanting to see is redevelopment, more so than even just development, but redevelopment of these older properties that are not performing well. Important for the tax base, important for the city. And so in those cases, if you took an old office building, retail center, and redeveloped it, there's actually a component to the bill where fees are waived, and you're not having to pay what in some cases can be very significant fees related to development. And that's been a big headwind. Impact fees, park fees have only been increasing over time, but especially over the last couple of years. Right. And so that's going to be significant. But let's just say you have a 15-acre commercially zoned property in Frisco. Now, under this bill, that 15 acres can be developed by right into multifamily. And the way that works is it's 36 units an acre of multifamily, which in our world, we know that you can stay surface parked. You can park all of the units just on the surface without having to do a garage at up to 36 units an acre. You can do a height of 45 feet, but actually in areas, in most of the areas this applies, if there are other multifamily projects at a higher density, you can develop to that density. So in a place like Frisco, where there's projects that are, 4 or 5 stories, they have parking garages, they're building maybe 80, 90, 100 units an acre, you can now go build 80, 90, 100 units an acre on these properties that qualify. And we were talking to a client about this the other day that said, I don't think there's very many properties zoned like that exist. And so I don't think the bill is really going to be applied that often. And I'll let you answer kind of what we talked to him about. But I think we kind of said, hey, that's not exactly right.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of properties that this applies to. And I think we've flushed through that pretty quickly just in the last 30 days as we were prepping for this bill to get signed into law. There's so many properties that allow for this type of use and type of conversion. And so that has been probably the overwhelming part is, okay, where are all the opportunities? Well, they're kind of all over the place, right? And so there's a little bit of the last couple of weeks, all of a sudden, there's been this big shift of developers catching on to the bill, calling us saying, hey, I'm in on SB 840. We need to go find sites. And it's really the top groups in the marketplace. It's not just a few groups. It's everybody's caught on to it now. Well, what you're having right now at very live time is all the owners are starting to catch up to that as well. And so at first it was like, hey, there's some low hanging fruit here, which there still is because there's people that want to sell and want to see their property, converted with this SB 840 and put into production for multifamily. But you're also starting to see the cases where landowners are saying, hey, SB 840 is a real thing. I'm going to increase my price. I'm going to decrease my timing, buy it now. And so the market's really going to be almost flushing out what is a real opportunity for SB 840 and what is somebody who thinks, okay, well, now my property's worth 50% more, 100% more, or something unrealistic. And so I think the positive thing there is that it's just going to prohibit every single commercially zoned site from becoming multifamily because you still have the owner side of it. The market still has to believe this site would make sense.
Yeah, it's going to be hard. I think we're already seeing even the days leading up to the bill officially becoming, and I say becoming law, it doesn't actually take effect until September 1st. But getting through, the time period between when it was passed and when the governor had his time period where he could veto it, we're already seeing landowners increase their prices on real deals, 50% price increase, comments, I'm going to now want a 30-30 type timing on my site. And the flip side of all of this is we're in an interesting market right now where the equity availability is challenging. Now, yes, some of these areas are incredible areas. And so there's definitely projects that can get done. But I do think when you move into the competitive environment we may be moving into where there's so many potential sites, you're right. One of the reasons why we're going to see a natural kind of stranglehold on what gets done is landowners just having unrealistic expectations and thinking if I hold out, maybe I can get more or maybe I can get better terms. And I think we both expect, and we're going to talk about this in a minute, that there's going to be some pushback from some of these cities and there could be additional legislation that comes down the pipeline here in the future where it might make it difficult to actually proceed with some of these developments. And so early adopters, early movers, I think are actually going to be the big winners here. Initially, a lot of developers had been telling us, well, we just don't want to be the first ones. We want to wait and see. To your point, now it's kind of like the big blue chip developers, like the ones that everybody knows, big household names. A lot of them do a lot of institutional deals. They're the ones calling us and saying, okay, we want to go and proceed and look at these type of opportunities.
Right.
And so I think that's really interesting. And this doesn't just apply to Frisco and Irving and, Garden multifamily. This applies to areas, urban areas like Fort Worth and Dallas, to PD 193 in uptown Dallas. And, you have, I didn't mention it, but you have setback requirements that are reduced. You don't have to do traffic studies. You have FAR is removed now. So you can't say, the FAR is 3.5. I mean, now if it makes sense, and like you said earlier, the market will dictate it, a site that maybe you never could have gotten more than 6-7 stories on, if it makes sense, you could go do a high rise on that site if it qualifies. So that's going to be interesting.
And there's also the aspect of the parking ratio. It reduces the parking requirement to 1 per unit, which is pretty aggressive. And I think that goes back to, there's been enough developers over time who've said, 1 parking spot per unit, like that's just not enough. And so you're going to have developers who say, hey, I'm still not going to build to that. And there's going to be cases where a lot of people tell you, I can't get equity to go do 1 parking spot per unit. And so I think some of that is going to be okay in how it operates. And, I'm curious from your standpoint, because you obviously spent a good part of your career in Houston, you know, this was kind of how things operate in Houston, right? Is, you know, there's no zoning. It's really just finding a site that makes sense. And so how do you feel like it translates?
Yeah, that's interesting because developers have been mentioning we don't want to become like Houston or we're going to become like Houston. We hear that a lot
right
up here. I think it's, you know, from being in Houston for a decade and doing land brokerage there and working on sites, you know, that could be really any use. First of all, as a land broker, it is a lot of fun. So you're right. This is something that we kind of look forward to, this type of a market. And land brokers are really valuable in those kind of markets because it has a lot to do with understanding the market and what makes sense in the market as to what it can be. But natural things that we saw happen in Houston were, you know, if you were, let's just say, in an area like West University or Rice Village, you know, in any acre to 2 acres, you could justify as a high rise. You really could. But what would happen is landowners would start to want prices, and kind of every landowner that had enough land would want that kind of a price. And often those prices were like just out of reach of what made sense for developers. Yep. And so it wasn't that just because there was 2 acres and it could be a multifamily high rise that there was 4 multifamily high rises going. There's some of those areas where if you could get a landowner to sell at a reasonable price, you almost felt like you'd be doing the last development in that submarket because it was just so difficult to get these landowners to sell at reasonable numbers. And so we saw that a lot. And, you know, then there's other things that will come into play: utility capacity, potential deed restrictions. Right. You know, it's always a little bit probably more complicated than just every site will be available. But the inverse happens too from a landowner perspective. If you're in markets where there is a lot of appetite for landowners to sell, now the market's flooded with opportunities. Yeah. So it goes from, you know, it'd be incredible to go get a project done in this area to maybe there are like 6 opportunities now. And that could be what happens in an area like Frisco, right, where it was really difficult to get anything done. Now, at least on paper, there's going to be a lot of opportunities. We'll see how many of those pan out. Yeah. But, you know, we're already seeing in Frisco, landowners double their prices. Yep. So that's just naturally going to happen.
Yeah. And I think you absolutely are right off the bat. You're going to have cities that are going to do everything they can. They're going to come up with every angle they can to try and prevent this from taking place in their city. And that part of it, I just am eager to see how it plays out because, like you said, with other laws that have been put into place, like cities have to respond to you on your site plan within 30 days. You know, that hasn't necessarily come to fruition, right? It's just one of those things where as a developer, you keep saying, okay, well, you got back to me in 45 days. That took longer than expected, but I still need to advance my plan. So I'm not going to, you know, cause a big problem over this. Like I still need to get my deal done. Yeah. And so it'll just be interesting to see how this progresses. I think the other immediate shift that we're seeing is that, you know, sites out on the edges of town in your Salinas, Melissas, Annas, you know, South Fort Worth, you know, going to just different parts of town where it's been harder to make deals pencil, but guys are going down there because there's zone sites and there's opportunity. We're already starting to see a pullback in some of that because instead of going out to the suburbs and really trying to compete with deals that are on the ground that aren't doing well and seeing if you can get equity, it's really a chase to go back more infill into these first tier markets, you know, like we've been talking about. And ultimately, I think that's really exciting because it gives us as land brokers, like you said, the opportunity to go chase some sites that otherwise would have never really been an opportunity. Some commercially zoned sites that even, you know, look beyond a Frisco, but go to a Plano or Irving or whatever. You know, we look at some of those sites and it's zoned commercial and you're just kind of shaking your head. There's no way that'll ever get to be multifamily. And now it really gets to be fun, chasing some of these opportunities that really could become pretty cool projects.
Well, I think you're talking about a really interesting impact of the bill is it's kind of become the new shiny toy for all the developers. And so it's pretty distracting. And what we don't know yet is exactly how successful developers will be in executing on it. But for the sake of sites that are zoned out in these suburban areas, there have been this big push to the suburbs, like you said, because the thought process was if there's garden multifamily zone sites, those are valuable. They just have value in and of themselves because cities aren't giving that kind of zoning out anymore. What we were seeing from all these cities is they would go through the life cycle of growth where they were pro-development and they would zone properties for multifamily, and then they would start requiring, whether it's ground floor retail, whether it's structured parking, they start requiring these things that just a lot of times they never work.
Right.
And you just don't see developments that are successful when you have to do this. And then eventually they just shut off development altogether.
Yep.
And so that's why you had developers, way out on the fringe, but they're buying sites that had zoning, and it was hard to compete with them because cities weren't giving zoning. Well, now there's this belief that, with this law, you can suddenly come back into all what most developers would refer to as like the first ring suburbs of DFW. And the thought that you could once again go build, surface parked multifamily. I think that's where most developers are the most excited is being able to build surface parked multifamily because it's very affordable to develop. To be able to do that in Irving again, or, Arlington, you already were seeing it in places like Grand Prairie, but you really weren't seeing it in Plano and Frisco anymore. McKinney was almost out of land for that type of development. So I think that, that little bit of a distraction is probably going to just create some turbulence in the multifamily land market in some of these outlying areas for a while. We even talked to a developer that I think we were both advising against this, but they were saying, well, now I don't know if I want to chase this zoned site because maybe there's going to be this opportunity over here. And we're like, be careful that you don't, throw away the bird in hand for the deal that maybe you never get.
Yeah.
Because it's just, there's still a lot of unknowns around how this is actually going to be received and the success rate for the developers pursuing these.
Yeah, that's right. And as we said, we still don't know how cities are going to try to combat this. We've heard some rumblings of certain municipalities being a little bit more accepting of it, like Arlington and Irving have said, this isn't we're going to have an influx of multifamily, but, it's going to be the law. So there's people who are understanding, hey, this is going to be a law, right? And we need to follow that. And then there's, just other ways in which it's going to be approached. But the interesting thing too is like with Fort Worth and Dallas, there's certain pockets of it. You mentioned PD 193 in Dallas. The hard part with PD 193 has always been the FAR and the Oak Lawn Committee, and they want to dictate all underground parking, and some of those things go away. And so you kind of get some of that negotiation power. That's really exciting. But, there's so many areas of Fort Worth and Dallas where if you've really wanted to build a project, the city's generally been open to rezoning, right? And so maybe the fundamental advantage there is you can maybe get through Dallas a little bit quicker because you don't have to go all the way through city council, what have you. That remains to be seen. But I think when you're talking about a Dallas or Fort Worth, the biggest challenges for those cities have not been zoning, right? It's been time that it takes to work through them. Now we've talked a lot about Frisco. We've talked about McKinney. Plano is another one. I mean, Plano, unless you were going to do structured parking, it's like, don't even try. And really on commercially zoned sites, don't even try to begin with. Right.
Yeah.
And so that's exciting. I think the other thing that really gets created out of this is people who own zone sites in better submarkets that aren't into the category of 150,000 people that don't meet the requirements of this bill. So if you have a zone site in a Richardson, those type of opportunities, I think those start to get really interesting as this plays out, because if you have 5 projects that get put on the ground in McKinney out of nowhere on commercially zoned sites, there's going to be supply to chew through and those types of problems. But then, you go to a place like Richardson, you're not going to have that same battle long term. And so those things I think are still very much in play and very interesting to think about as we kind of move forward.
Yeah, that's a good point. And I think you bring up a really good point about just cities that we expect to be, and it's hard to know, but a little bit easier to work with versus difficult. And we're basing this off of just historically when we've, gone and approached cities with different zoning cases.
Right.
We've had some really rough experiences. You mentioned it earlier on the 30-acre mixed-use, really high-quality project. We had one in Grand Prairie years ago that was a commercial site where the poor owner was like, we've owned the site. It was one where they had owned it for 3 or 4 decades.
Yep.
And he's like, we've talked to every retailer and commercial developer in existence. No one wants this property.
Right.
And we had a really incredible plan with a client of ours to do a mixed use project with a park, and they were working with the neighbors, and the city ultimately just said, nope, needs to stay commercial.
Yep.
And so that's really why this law is coming into play. And so obviously there's going to be pushback, but I think there's a reason why it was passed. And I'm hoping that it does accomplish a lot of what it was intended to accomplish. Now, certain cities we think are going to be a little more open to it.
Right.
I don't want to speak for those cities, but I think, like you said, DFW for sure, Dallas and Fort Worth, we feel like already we're very pro-development. They understand like so much of the growth is going to these suburbs. They want more of that growth for themselves.
Right.
But then also areas like Denton, they're probably one of the smallest cities that qualifies here. They like just, bridge that 150,000 population hurdle. They've been very pro-development. I would think that they will remain very pro-development here. They may not have quite as much land as some other cities that's just classified like this, but we know that they do because we're already looking at some of that. And then I think some of the, Arlington, Grand Prairie, I think Arlington's probably more open to it than Grand Prairie.
Yeah.
But I think in some cases, Grand Prairie will recognize some of the benefits that this will bring too. And you brought up an interesting point earlier. Some of these council men and women have run on these platforms of like no more multifamily.
Right.
And that's happened to us so many times. We're trying to go zone a project. It's going to be an incredible project. And it's like, well, they're running for reelection. We got to pull it.
Yeah.
It's so political. Although they've made these promises, now it's kind of outside their control.
Right.
And so this is an interesting fallback for some of these council members to basically say like, I don't really support it, but this is Texas law.
Yeah.
And in a lot of cases, it is what's going to be good for these cities. Vacant retail, vacant office, or nearly vacant office and retail is not good for cities. And so it's great for it to be redeveloped into these other uses.
It's not good on the tax rolls. It's not good aesthetically. And you mentioned all these council members. It's really interesting because so many of them have made these promises as to their residents of, I will make sure your strip center doesn't ever get turned into apartments or townhomes or whatever, industrial, whatever it may be. And it's, I don't mean to pick on the council members, but it feels heavy-handed to promise something to a resident
that you can't really
control. Right? And so I think that's where kind of the checks and balance of the bill come in to say, hey, again, hopefully everybody comes to the table with kind of a new look on how to negotiate, because several of the developers that we're making offers with for this bill, they're all saying, I'm not trying to go close on this thing and ram it down a city's throat in terms of like what I have to build. I'm going to build under SB 840. A lot of them are taking the approach of, I really hope this helps us in the conversation with the city.
Yeah.
And so I think all that's very positive. I think talking for a few minutes just about what we're already seeing in practice. There's obviously the aspect of, okay, what is the bill? How is it going to be treated by the municipalities? Some of that we still don't totally know, but what we're seeing right now is there are groups who believe this is going to happen and they are pursuing it and they're putting money behind it. And it's top groups in the market. It's not little name, one-off shops. It's pretty much all the top developers. And so some of the offers we've made and had offers come in on our listings, right? That we've had groups offer for SB 840 type timeframes. And there's kind of two buckets of groups right now. There is the bucket that is, I just want to tie up a site, have control over it, and see if this magically all comes up and I can do this project. And so we've gotten some offers where it's, hey, here's a 9-month due diligence timeframe. I just want to get as much time as possible. And I think the general landowner is already educated on this bill enough to the point where those type of offers are not really getting any traction. And then you have the other bucket of groups that are really saying, hey, I'll ask for a standard 90, 120 day due diligence that gets me past September 1st. That at least gets me to the point where before I go non-refundable with my earnest money, I'm having conversations with the city to at least know what is the temperature going to be when I walk into this room and how are they going to treat it. And so we're starting to see more and more developers at least be willing to take that bet of, hey, as we move into July and the later part of the summer, if the bill goes into effect in September 1st, by the time you get something agreed to under contract, et cetera, what we're talking about with a 90-day due diligence, you're already past that. And so you have a baseline understanding of what you need. And so I think there's definitely kind of two buckets of groups, and one that's really emerging as the type that's actually going to get control over a lot of these sites. And then you have the reflection there with the landowners. And that's been really interesting because there are some people, like we talked about earlier, with the mindset of, hey man, I've owned this site since the 80s. I have not been able to sell it. The city will not let me rezone it. Like, this is my chance. I'm going to be reasonable in what I'm asking for in a sale because this is finally a chance for me to monetize and move on from this land. And then you have landowners who are playing games with it, right? And immediately I'm raising my price 50%. And hey, since this is a law, you should be able to close in 60 days. And a lot of things that just don't make sense. But it's really interesting. Just on a daily basis, we're out making offers for this and just seeing how it kind of works through itself.
Yeah. I mean, we're advising a lot of landowners right now, either valuing their properties or, like you said, we're already marketing properties that are getting these type of offers. And then really the same thing for developers. And so maybe we kind of walk through some of what we're advising to both of those parties. I can start on the landowner side. I think you brought up a really good point. Don't be one of those landowners that is looking for something really unreasonable, because there's some of these landowners that they've been having a hard time selling their properties.
Yep. This
is a huge gift. So don't now go and, it's the famous saying in our business, it's like pigs get fat, hogs get slaughtered. Like,
right.
Don't become that kind of a person. Really focus on the best quality developer that has a good plan. And I think we both know somebody that still has capital is really important. I would not be a landowner right now focused on the highest price or the quickest deal. I would be focused a lot on what zoning consultant are they using? How much have they studied the law? Why do they need the time that they need? Are they willing to put any money up after their regular due diligence? Because we both know it's unlikely that after even 90 days, you're really going to know that you're safe under this law. So the landowner that wants a 30-30 is living in la land. Like, that doesn't exist. At least not right now. Not until this law is like very proven.
Yeah.
So I think that landowners picking the quality developers that have the capital, not focusing on price, is still what's really important. I think this is a window of time that if it's going to be capitalized on, it's capitalized on. And if you miss the window, so if you're the developer that says, I don't want to be the first one, I'm going to wait and see, or like you were saying earlier, you kind of put a property under contract, you don't really do anything, you're going to get to the end of your due diligence and realize you need an extension, and the landowner is going to have like 12 to 20 backup offers. We're already seeing that.
Right.
If you don't get on this as a developer now, here we are kind of second half of June. If you don't get on this now, by the time the end of summer rolls around, like the good properties and the decent pricing on properties is going to be gone. There's just too much competition in the market that we're in.
Right. I think you bring up a good point about having the capital, because as we progress through the end of the year, there's a lot of sellers who are going to want to see you taking risk and putting up non-refundable earnest money in the sense of, I will work with you to track through this SBA 40, but you got to be putting something at risk. It can't just be like a freebie look until 2026 to see how it all plays out. And I think right now, most developers are saying, hey, I can't go close on this without a permit because I have to know that the city is going to play ball with me, but I'm going to have to stair step some pretty large earnest money to get there. And like you said, there's people who are already maybe misguided and misusing the opportunity from a landowner standpoint. Like we had a deal just fall out of contract where the developers been working through a rezone for nearly a year. They were willing to put up non-refundable earnest money to extend, to keep working through the rezone that seemed probable.
Yeah.
And the owner, terminated the deal and walked away from non-refundable earnest money because his site is commercially zoned, and he's going to see what the Senate bill and what the opportunity here is. And unfortunately, bird in the hand, right? He's looking at it as there might be a higher price out there.
Yeah.
And that's not necessarily the truth. You're not necessarily going to get a higher price than the group who's already got hundreds of thousands of dollars, if not seven figures, committed to the deal because they're trying to get it zoned.
That's a good example. And a client mentioned this. In that market that you're talking about has other opportunities.
Right.
So the client mentioned something to tell these landowners is in these markets that have other opportunities, your land might get less valuable.
Yep.
Because yes, now we know we can build a multifamily, but so did the other 5 owners in a half-mile radius. And now we're wondering if it's oversupplied.
Yeah.
And if we're willing to take that chance, maybe we're feeling like we can't pay quite as much as this other client was going through a really difficult, long zoning process, but that difficult, long zoning process actually adds value to the property when it gets zoned versus now everything can just be developed. And so that's why in like a market like Houston, you have the landowners that want really high prices, but then when there are sites and areas that get a lot of development, then there's like no development for a couple of years or several years because it gets overbuilt.
And the interesting thing too is if that owner had chose to let the developer try to finish out the zoning, then he would have a site that is zoned for multifamily, regardless of how the cities decide to combat SB 840. And so there's going to be a lot of decisions like that made where you say, I don't know if that's exactly what I would have done, but we're seeing it happen every day right now, and it's such a huge focus in the market. We always talk about how we track our offers and track our opportunities, and coming into the office on Monday morning before we were even done with our Monday team meetings at 10 a.m., we had a week's worth of offers in our inbox for these type of opportunities. And so it's very live in how everybody's chasing it.
Yeah, it's going to be just a huge influx of activity over the summer. We're already seeing it, but it's definitely going to continue. So maybe we go to kind of the takeaways. We walked through the law, we walked through the implications, a lot of uncertainty still, but the reality of, I think you have to try to be a first mover if you can. If you're a landowner and you think your site qualifies, it's really important, I think, to get good advice. So we're happy to talk to you. I mean, that's really how I'd say most of the conversations we're having right now are about this.
Right.
We're either talking to landowners about this and how it impacts their land. For us, it's a really fun conversation because we're having conversations now about, areas like Irving where we're looking at sites that historically we would have been approaching it knowing, okay, this is unlikely that you can get zoning at all. But if you could, this is probably what it would be. Now we can look at it and just with our knowledge of multifamily, having closed almost 400 multifamily land deals now, which is crazy. But with our knowledge of multifamily, we can look at these sites and say, there's like 3 or 4 different product types you could justify on this. Okay, but what's best for the landowner? Yeah. Like what gets them the highest price? And just kind of pros and cons of that process. We love doing that. We're doing that a lot right now. So if you're a landowner, I think that's really going to be important is don't wait too long and be very careful who you sign up with because you could sign up with the developer tomorrow, but pick the wrong developer. And by the time they're out of contract, you miss the window. Versus, the landowners that pick the right developers, that window of time that this bill can be capitalized on closes. And so I think that would be my advice versus requiring like a really high price or a really quick close. It would be making sure that you're picking the right buyer and more focused on getting the transaction to the finish line. Because if you have a false start in this case, you may never get a second chance at the Senate bill.
Right. And it's interesting you talk about the early movers, early adopters, and people that are acting fast. We haven't even talked about this, but there's a possibility that some of these cities let some of the early adopters through while they try to work through it and try to figure out where is our legal ground, what is our loophole, how are we going to combat it. They might, at risk of getting into a legal battle at risk of being in a lawsuit. There might be some municipalities that let the first 3, 4, 5 guys just go do it, right? And so there's definitely an advantage on that, but I think you're going to quickly see a lot of the land sites get tied up. I think that's just a natural progression of where we're headed. The thing I would say that I'm really excited about this bill is just there's a lot of sites as we drive around, North Dallas, over near our office, those type of things where you say, man, that site just doesn't make sense.
Yeah.
It would be so much better served as pick whatever use, right? A mixed use development, a multifamily development, townhomes, et cetera. And I think it just creates the opportunity for us to work on some really fun opportunities where we would normally said, there's no way that we're going to get that through. So, I think that's going to be fun. I think that there's certainly already just so much buzz in the air about this. And so we're, as you said, really excited to just keep talking to owners and developers about it and see how we can continue to advise people. And we are staying up to date on it daily, if not more frequently than that, and continuing to talk to everybody that we can to stay knowledgeable on it.
Yeah, I don't think that we can kind of overestimate how impactful this is, just knowing that there's Senate bills and there's House bills that get passed all the time. And when's the last time that we spent even close to this much time, or developers? This bill is being talked about, I think, by everyone, and just, it isn't even technically in effect yet, but I think the implications are going to be big. So it's going to be fun to get to work on some of these sites, work with a lot of our clients through this, and then, just getting to advise landowners, which is what we love to do, talking about their properties and trying to help them figure out how we can help them solve their goals, whether that's getting a certain price or a timing, whatever it is. This could be a huge opportunity to exit some properties.
And it feels like I'm underselling it here because this is probably even more at a greater magnitude. But the last thing I can really think of in the land business to this type of effect in Texas was, the ETJ bill that allowed people to develop in the ETJ without annexing. And this far and away supersedes what we're talking about from the amount of properties that could be put into production. And I just hope that it leads to better projects and better opportunities for everybody.
Well, and we talk about land, but I think, the goal here in a lot of cases is just office and retail that's not performing well, which we still look at that as land.
Yes.
The value of the underlying land is worth more than the improvements. And so that's probably what I'm most excited about is I think a lot of those owners, they're used to going and talking to maybe leasing brokers or investment sales brokers that don't really understand the land market the way that we do. And how do you break down a 15-acre office complex into like land value, especially in this type of a conversation where we're talking about the lack of zoning and land value. What different developers can pay is going to fluctuate significantly, whether or not they can perform on a contract. So it's important to keep that in mind. That I think is the main purpose of this bill. And hopefully what it really accomplishes is just redevelopment of a lot of these assets that are really poorly performing, and we have to clean up. These commercial corridors are often the most heavily trafficked, most viewed corridors in our cities. And so hopefully this really helps just, clean these cities up, and is great for the tax base. And as much as people seem to hate multifamily, which is kind of a little bit funny at the same time that everyone just hates it so much. I think there's a lot of great multifamily that can get developed under this bill that will be good for cities.
Yeah, for sure. And I keep going back to the market will dictate, right? Because ultimately, if 5 projects get rolled out right across the street from each other, eventually somebody's going to say, no, I don't want to build more multifamily right there. So I think it'll all be okay. It's just a lot to work through right now.
Well, this was fun. Thanks, Trey. I think putting on our bill hat here is a little bit unique for us. We're not used to getting into more of the legal aspect of things, but this one's been fun, and I think we're primed and ready to spend a lot of time working on it.
Yes, please do call us if you have any questions about it. We are happy to keep talking about this.
All right, thanks, Trey.
Thank you for listening to our podcast today. If you have questions about land you own in Texas, send us an email at texaslandguys@dmre.com and follow us on LinkedIn to stay updated.